All right, in this example, we are going to look at some various numbers that we're going to have to solve for missing variables. And so we've got all of these numbers and we're going to have to solve for that. So we need to understand the financial statement numbers and the way it all works. So that's what we're going to kind of walk you through here in this example. Now, before we do that, I want you to know that this is a difficult problem, but it doesn't have to be too difficult. What makes this difficult is it's combining a whole bunch of other lessons that we've done and mixes them together and says, okay, based on all of that information that we taught you, we're going to put it into one problem and then you need to solve. So as you go through this example, it's going to be easier by watching this than actually doing it on your own. I know that because I'm your crutch. I'm helping you through the problem. Whereas if you were doing it on your own, you have to utilize what you know, which isn't mastered yet. Just like, right now you probably can do 2 plus 2 in your head because that's you've mastered that over a long period of time. This stuff you're just learning. So it might be a little bit difficult as you try to deal with it because you haven't mastered it. But hopefully as you go through this lesson in this video, that you understand the thought that I'm telling you on how we're answering this question. So understand the process, not just the calculation. Because if you do that, you can't replicate it later on it like an exam or maybe even on a homework assignment. So understand the process here. And I know this is a kind of a difficult problem at the end. So let's take a look at our prompt here. Information that's given to us about company A is provided below, and it wants us to solve the missing information. So here, the missing information is the net income, the total assets, and the retained earnings at the end. Everything else is given to us. So now we have to utilize all the other information that's here to kind of backtrack or forward track to get to the A, B, and C. So let's go ahead and move the screen here to give us a little bit more room. And so here I'm going to kind of walk us through how I would kind of look at this if I was trying to solve this. So what do we know here? Well, we know that we're missing some things and we know that we have numbers. So that tells us that we need to know some type of formula. Well, if we look throughout this first section, we learned a couple of formulas. Well, what formulas did we learn? Well, we learned that revenues minus expenses equals net income, right? We did learn that. That's the net income equation. We also learned the basic accounting equation, and the basic accounting equation is assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity or owner's capital. So we know that. And then in example 1, we kind of learned an equation. It really isn't an equation, it's just a process. But if we wanted to turn it into an equation, we could. We learned the equation for statement of retained earnings. And the reason why we need that, or we might need that, is because we have retained earnings here at the bottom that we have to solve. So we know that we take beginning retained earnings and we add net income and then we subtract dividends to get our ending retained earnings. So we know that. There was one more that we learned, which was owner's equity. Owner's equity equals revenues plus owner's capital minus dividends minus owner's withdrawal or dividends. Minus expenses. So that could be one here, but it's not. So we'll save the space here because there's not a lot, but that's not. So that is another one. So those are the 4 equations. All right. So another thing that we can think about here is we can start plugging in numbers into these 3 equations to see what works. But we can also think about to one specific lesson that I talked about, which was the order in which information flows on a financial statement, right? So we start with net income, and then we go to the statement of retained earnings, and then we go to the balance sheet, and then we go to statement of cash flows. I'm a visual person, so sometimes I kind of like to see it the way that I saw it. So that's why I'm like pointing to these imaginary things. But if you saw that lesson, that's exactly what we did. We started with the income statement over here, and then we did the statement of retained earnings here, and then we went to the balance sheet, and then we went to the statement of cash flow. So that's what we did. That might be a way to solve this here by starting with our income statement or our net income, which is revenues minus expenses, and then going to our statement of retained earnings, which we have that equation, and then going to our balance sheet, which would be our basic accounting equation, assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity. So we could do that. So let's try that here. We'll start off with what we would start off on a financial statement, which is our net income, revenues minus expenses. Now, is there anything here? Can we get information here that would help us get to that? Well, let's look. Do we have revenues? Well, we have revenues of $225. So we have $225 of revenues. Do we have any expenses? Expenses of $125. So we've got expenses, and according to our equation here, we're going to subtract expenses from revenue. So if I subtract $125, I get a net income of $100. So do we need that number? Well, if we look at the first line, it says net income. That's one of the variables we've got to solve here. And so we know that net income is $100. All right, check mark. Going on to the next thing. So what's the next thing? Well, we have the income statement, and then from there we flow to our statement of retained earnings. So we have an equation for that. So let's just start filling it out. So the statement of retained earnings, we would start with beginning retained earnings. So what's our beginning retained earnings here? 65. So we'll start with 65 here. Do we have any net income? We just calculated that. So our net income would be what? $100. So we're going to add $100. Do we have any dividends? Dividends here, $15. So we'll subtract $15. And then that will give us our ending retained earnings. So what's our ending retained earnings? Well, 65 plus 100 is 165. Subtracting 15 gives us 150. So our retained earnings at the end of the year must be $150. So our ending retained earnings would be $150. All right, 2 down, 1 to go. And the last one that we're going to talk about is the asset. So what would give us to the asset? Well, that's the balance sheet. The balance sheet is made up of the accounting equation. The basic accounting equation is assets plus equals liabilities plus owner's equity. Now, this one's a little difficult. If you didn't think the rest were difficult, this is a little bit difficult. If you thought the others was difficult, then go back and watch those lessons and come back. But what's going to be difficult is we have to understand the components of owner's capital or owner's equity. And if we don't know that, that's going to be tough because we don't have total equity here to kind of go off of. And so that's going to be a problem. If you don't understand that, you won't be able to get to that last one here, but let me walk you through it. So we know that assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity. So what do we know? Well, we know that we can add up liabilities and owner's equity, and that will give us our asset, which is what we're trying to solve. So let's look for liabilities and owner's capital or owner's equity. So liabilities here, we've got a liability here, $43. So we'll start with $43. And then do we have any other liabilities? Well, no, because that's a total. So we'll skip over to owner's equity or owner's capital. So owner's equity, owner's capital. So we're going to have to look for things that would be in owner's capital or owner's equity. So in this case here, what would go into owner's capital? Well, owner's capital includes owner's contribution in the form of common stock. So do we have common stock? Yep, $45. So maybe we'll add 45. It also includes revenues and expenses. So revenues minus expenses would be net income. So net income would be $150. And then dividends. Well, the thing about dividends is we've already kind of worked with dividends, and that is in our retained earnings number, so we won't necessarily worry about the dividends. So I know that's kind of weird here, but that dividends is right here in this number, so we don't need it anymore because we've got that dividend. So once we've done that, we go 150 plus 43 plus 45, and that gives us total liabilities and owner's equity of 238. And so A equals 238. So our total assets would be 238. So that's how we solve this problem. So the biggest hiccup, I think, in my opinion here, is knowing the process because if you don't know the process, you won't even get to A, B, or C. And then the second thing here that I think is a problem is going to be knowing what goes into owner's equity or owner's capital. Generally speaking, and when you start to do the balance sheet, you'll have a better understanding of it. But it's going to be basically common stock, additional paid-in capital, and then retained earnings. If you add all those three up, you'll get owner's capital or owner's equity. And so we haven't really talked about that. It's a little bit tougher, but that doesn't mean you couldn't have solved it based on what we talked about in prior lessons. So 238 for total assets. So that might be the biggest difficulty here. All right, so we've got A is going to be 100, B is going to be 238, and C is going to be 150. So that is our example on the financial statement numbers and understanding how they flow through the financial statement and understanding what numbers we need to get to. Hope you enjoyed this lesson, and we'll see you in the next lesson where we're going to look at an example of the income statement and the balance sheet. So until then, we'll see you in that video. Hey guys, it is Patrick. Don't forget to press the like button and share this video with someone who could get a lot of use from watching this lesson, like maybe a classmate or maybe a friend or maybe just a parent, just because you wanted to share this video because you're very excited about what you saw. Share it with someone. And if you want to help us grow and help us make sure that we put the very best in accounting topics out on YouTube, make sure you press the subscribe button and turn on that notification bell. That way you're alerted every time we post videos to this channel. Now, I do this with every one of my classes at the end of class. What did you learn from this lesson? Put that in the comment section below and I'll respond to you on what you got out of this video. So hope you enjoyed this video and we will see you in the next lesson.